So good afternoon, everyone. So it's a real pleasure for me to introduce you to our consortium, the More Medicines for Tuberculosis Consortium, and to tell you a little bit about how we're trying to address some of these issues. And there's going to be quite a bit of overlap between what the previous two speakers have said, so I'm going to whiz through the first couple of slides because a lot of these topics have already been covered. So you all know about TB, that it's different forms, dormant and active. We have a reasonable treatment for drug-susceptible TB, except that it's too long and the drugs are all antiquated. We have the high-burden countries. We have problems with MDR and XDR TB. Once again, the drugs are really old. They have lots of side effects, and the treatment duration is really unacceptably long. So we need to change all that. Now, a lot of what's been said so far about the situation with TB is actually true of the antibacterial sector in general, not just about what's happening with respect to curing tuberculosis. So I thought it would be instructive just to stand back and look at what's happened in the pharma industry in the last 30 or 40 years. And so you remember that in the 1970s, the US Surgeon General, William Stewart, questioned the need for new antibiotics. He said that the time had come to close the book on infectious diseases in the United States because everything was under control. And so this led to a shift of resources away from infectious diseases towards cancer, cardiovascular, and so on. In the pharma industry, everybody was producing beta-lactams, cephalosporins, and so on. So there were lots of Me Too drugs, and this saturated the market and made it difficult for people to generate large profits. In addition, when you come to develop drugs, antibacterials are much harder to develop than, for instance, anti-HIV drugs. The bacteria have evolved to resist toxic compounds. So as a result of these factors, the returns on investments for the pharmaceutical companies became slimmer and slimmer. And this caused many of them to move away from antibacterials into the chronic disease market, diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, and so on. You have a captive audience, a lifelong audience, and so your market has a much longer guarantee. Now, there are other reasons why developing antibacterials became difficult, and some of these are to do with the regulatory agency. So, for instance, the Food and Drugs Agency, which we've heard referred to earlier on. Pharma often says that getting approval is unpredictable and often unfeasible thanks to the way FDA behave, and this causes them to leave the anti-infectives market. In addition, antibiotics are considered unattractive career-wise because the people who may have stellar careers in the pharmaceutical industry are the ones who work on the blockbuster drugs, the people who discover the next statin, for instance. That will make a fortune, and so they'll get a better career path. So in the area of antibacterials, generally the skill base is disappearing. It was antibacterials which founded the entire pharma industry, and now paradoxically that skill base has disappeared. And more pharma companies are moving away from anti-infectives into the chronic care blockbusters. So the situation is bad for TB, but it's bad in general, in fact. So we've had, Grania's already covered this, and I think HIV/AIDS was a fantastic success story for the pharmaceutical industry. So in under 15 years, 35 agents have been approved for use by clinicians to treat HIV/AIDS. And here you have the life cycle of the HIV virus, and in fact, pretty much every step in the life cycle has been drugged. Pharma came up with fusion inhibitors, they came up with nucleotide reverse transcriptase inhibitors, non-nucleotide integrase inhibitors, protease inhibitors, the whole works. They drug pretty much everything in the HIV life cycle. So this was, I think, a spectacular success, and the pharmaceutical industry should be applauded and congratulated for doing that. This created wealth, and so there were a number of new companies which now became major players in the pharmaceutical sector, such as Gilead Sciences, and as Grania also pointed out, thanks to the HIV activists, this concept of socially responsible pricing emerged. But I'd like to be a little bit cynical and say, what would have happened if AIDS were not a chronic disease? Let's suppose that HIV/AIDS resulted from was more of an acute disease like Lassa fever. Would pharma have responded in the same way and to come up with all these wonderful drugs? I doubt it, because they can't. They would say they can't make a profit. So this, I think, the juxtaposition between socially responsible pricing and what I've just said, I think was intentional. So just now a few words about our consortium. So this, More Medicines for Tuberculosis, is the follow-up to another consortium known as New Medicines for Tuberculosis, which Simon, who's sitting here in the front row, he was a major partner in this project, in New Medicines. More Medicines developed from the New Medicines project, and we're 25 partners from 13 countries in Europe, America, Asia, and Africa. So we have good global representation. We have 2 pharmaceutical companies, so 2 big pharma, AstraZeneca and Sanofi, who are part of the consortium. And we have 4 small, medium enterprises, so that means there are 19 academic partners and 6 from the business sector. So these are our goals. So we're trying to explore chemical space, so we're looking at both synthetic organic compounds and natural products. We're generating new hits, and our ultimate objective is to come up with 5 new drug targets which have been pharmacologically validated, and we also want to discover at least 1 family of candidate drugs. And so we've been reasonably successful, and we have a good candidate which is in late stage preclinical development. And so in the More Medicines project we came up with a lead compound, BTZ-043, and now we've taken this on and developed a better version which has superior properties. So it has nanomolar whole cell activity against Mycobacterium tuberculosis. It works very well in murine models, and we're very excited about this because its activity is comparable to what, so this is isoniazide, lungs and spleens, and this is our compound in the same organ. So it has pretty good activity in the chronic model. It's safe and well tolerated, so it's been tested by against a lot of human receptors, hERG channels and so on. It's not genotoxic, and it's gone through maximum tolerated dose and all the rest of it in rats and dogs, and it seems to be well tolerated. But now what we need to do is to finish developing this compound. So a couple of years ago we licensed it to a pharma company who began the work, and then when the recession, the brunt of the recession hit, they withdrew. And so the clinical development now of this, it requires money, it also requires pharma experience, scientific and clinical infrastructure, regulatory understanding, and above all, I think it requires a long-term commitment. So there are 2 key factors, I think. One of them is money. You can't do anything without money. And the other one is that you need to have a much longer-term commitment to this than the current pharmaceutical companies seem to have. It's not something that you can solve in a few years. So I like to remind you of this quotation. This was made by George Merck, the founder of the Merck Pharmaceuticals company. We try never to forget that medicine is for the people. It is not for the profits. The profits follow, and if we have remembered that, they have never failed to appear. The better we have remembered it, the larger they have been. So this was George Merck in 1950. So I'm going to give you some quotations which I've recently encountered. So this is from the CEO of a European biotech. He said, "It's money first, health second." Right? And then this is from an agency, the Centre for Drug Design and Discovery, which was being set up by the European Union. So we approached them about trying to fund some of our work. This is difficult for us because the tuberculosis field is not a highly active field from the point of view of business partnering. So even the NGOs who are in this space acknowledge that this is an area where making a profit is going to be difficult. And this is all rather saddening. So what we've done is we've set up a not-for-profit foundation at EPFL. This is called the Innovative Medicines for Tuberculosis Foundation, and this is our mission statement. So we're trying to support, promote and actively participate in drug discovery and drug development concerning TB and similar poverty-related and neglected diseases. And so the compounds that we're interested in developing are also active against some of the other neglected diseases such as leprosy and borreliose. And we think it's important to try and do things on a sort of multi-disease front rather than limiting ourselves to one single disease. So why did we set up a foundation? Well, Grania has given you a lot of the reasons and the explanations. So first of all, the financial incentives are inadequate for most companies, so the TB market is far less lucrative than for other diseases, and this results in chronic underinvestment. There's been reduced investment in TB drug research and development, so you've already heard these points. Pfizer have withdrawn, Otsuka is decreasing its drug discovery efforts, and AstraZeneca recently closed down all their anti-infective work, including their R&D site in Bangalore in India, making 168 people redundant in the process. At the moment, there are only 4 out of 22 big pharmaceutical companies which are still supporting R&D in antibacterials. So, you know, this is a pretty grim situation. As we know, there's limited financial support available to progress preclinical drug candidates from the public sector. We have this funding gap. It's relatively easy to fund the discovery work. This is attractive, it's hypothesis driven, it's creative, and it's going to give rise to high profile publications. Clinical trials is also an area which is relatively well funded, but there's a gap between the two. This is starting to be addressed by EDCTP, but it's too late. We should have had joined up thinking from the beginning, rather than having taken products forward and then finding that they can't make it to the clinic because there's no funding there. And this stage of the project is actually very expensive, and it's also rather uninteresting because it's not science, it's process. It's putting into implementing standardized regulatory procedures. So if I'm ranting and raving, I should come up with some remedies as well. So this is what I think we should do. Well, first of all, we have to keep raising the awareness of the TB problem at all levels, both within our families, within our communities, at the political level, and higher. We need to get some form of concerted action from all the stakeholders here. So these are, be they governments, pharma and diagnostics companies, healthcare providers, even the health insurance people. The regulatory agencies, they also have a role to play, and I think they also need to be more creative. Then we have public research, the sector, philanthropists and advocacy groups. I'll come back to these points in a few seconds. So what about the role of regulatory agencies? Are the current standards which they're applying too high? Well, I'm not an expert in regulatory matters, far from it, but it's actually quite heartening to see that bedaquiline, this new TB drug, which was recently approved by FDA, has been approved without ever being tested in a phase 3 clinical trial. And maybe we need to rethink it's been approved for MDR TB. And so maybe we need to think about reconfiguring clinical trials. 50% of the drug costs come from phase 3, the phase 3 stage. If we had bigger phase 2A, perhaps we could compensate for some of that and reduce the development costs. I don't know, I'm not an expert in this area, but I think these are ideas which merit discussion. We've heard that much of the TB problem is in the BRICS. The BRICS are very good pharmaceutical industries. They make most of the generic medicines in the world. It would be good perhaps if they could engage as well in some of the more innovative stuff. Maybe they could license in some of the patents that the Western pharma doesn't wish to pursue. Drug development also needs to be made more attractive, both in terms of a career. There's some really exciting science which can be done around drug development, but if those drugs are going to actually make it into the clinic, the whole arena needs to be more attractive in terms of funding, recovering investment, translating science into applications. So the funding model needs to change. We need more. There's a lot of funding that goes into discovery. This is desirable, but we also need more funding made available for actually developing the things which are discovered. And this is missing from the public sector. If you address the private sector to try and fill that gap, what they'll tell you is that it's very hard to make a profit for venture capital companies, for instance. The timeline is too long. They have to make a return in a couple of years. So there has to be some kind of an incentive. So we've heard an interesting way of, with this 3 Ps, if that's the correct acronym, the initiative. I mean, I think that's quite an attractive way forward. I mean, philanthropy has been picking up some of the slack. I think the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for instance, have contributed quite a lot of money to the TB sector, but this is also a somewhat capricious source of funding. We need something which is more sustainable, and otherwise we're going to be in big trouble, because you know, as we've heard, MDR-TB is a colossal problem, and it's something which we won't be able to solve in the short term. It's going to require longer commitment, and this will need sustainable funding. And in order to get this funding, I think we have to, so this is one way of getting better funding, the Innovative Medicines Initiative, which is a new partnership between the European pharmaceutical industry and academia. But I think what we need above all is to raise awareness about this problem. We have to be much more vocal. We have to, you know, bend the ears of all the politicians and the decision makers, and make them realize that unless they do something about MDR-TB now, this problem will come to haunt future generations as well as our own. With that, I think I should stop. So thank you for listening.